Have you ever wondered what happens when a power-hungry HOA president messes with the wrong homeowner? After getting slapped with some ridiculous fines over my beloved cat, I decided it was time to remind everyone exactly who wrote the HOA bylaws they were so eager to abuse. Let's just say karma has a way of coming back, with extra sharp claws. Welcome to my channel. Please subscribe if you want more Karen and HOA stories. My hands were shaking as I read the bright red notice taped to my front door. $500. That's how much the HOA wanted me to pay for having an unauthorized exotic pet. I looked down at William, my perfectly normal orange tabby cat, who was rubbing against my legs like he did every evening when I got home from work. He was about as exotic as a peanut butter sandwich. I had just finished a long, exhausting day at the law firm when I found that absurd notice. The date showed it had been posted that morning, probably right after I left for work. That's when I saw something else that made my blood boil. Karen Emma's signature at the bottom, and next to it, her new title, HOA Board President. Karen had only lived in our neighborhood for 6 months, but she'd already made herself infamous. She complained that Mr. Rodriguez's wind chimes were too ethnic. She reported Jessica's memorial garden for decreasing property values. And now this nonsense about my cat? The funny thing, I'd lived in Oakwood Heights for 15 years, 10 of which I served as the HOA's legal counsel. I literally wrote every single one of those bylaws they were now trying to use against me. But Karen didn't know that. She'd never bothered to check the records, or even introduce herself properly. I grabbed my phone, snapped pictures of the notice, and carefully peeled it from my door. Through my front window I saw Karen standing on her porch across the street, pretending to water her garden. A garden filled with illegal pink flamingo decorations. Yes, illegal. Section 7.3 of the bylaws specifically addressed lawn ornaments, a rule I had written myself, to be flexible for reasonable homeowners. But right now, those flamingos were the least of my concerns. Inside, I found another copy of the notice had been slipped under my door, along with a thick packet of violation documentation. I spread everything out across the kitchen table while William jumped up to inspect the mess. The evidence included blurry photos of my cat sitting in the window, a highlighted copy of the pet regulations, and, this made me laugh out loud, a printed WebMD article about exotic pet diseases. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my neighbor, Tom Baker. "Did you get one too?" I was about to reply when I heard loud voices outside. Through my kitchen window I watched Karen leading her friend Emily door to door, a thick stack of papers in hand. They stopped at Jessica's house and my stomach twisted. The elderly widow was still grieving her husband. The last thing she needed was harassment over her memorial garden. I was just about to go outside when the doorbell rang. It was James, our neighborhood treasurer for the past 8 years. His usually cheerful face looked tense. "Listen," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "You need to know what happened at today's emergency board meeting." Karen had pushed through a set of new enforcement procedures. She was targeting at least 6 other homeowners with sudden fines, calling it her neighborhood improvement initiative. I invited James inside. As he shared more, I started taking notes. Karen had somehow convinced the board to give her direct enforcement authority, a clear violation of Section 3.2 of the bylaws, and she'd also appointed Emily as her enforcement deputy, a position that didn't even exist in our HOA structure. As James left, I walked him to the door just in time to see Karen marching up Jessica's driveway with another notice in hand. Through the cool evening air I heard Jessica's distressed voice. "But this bench, it's all I have left of him." That was the breaking point. I didn't write those bylaws to bully people. I wrote them to protect our community. I went to my home office and pulled out my old HOA files. If Karen wanted to play with rules, she was about to learn an important lesson about what happens when you mess with the person who wrote them. I looked at William, now curled up on my desk calendar. "What do you say, buddy? Ready to help me teach them about karma?" He blinked slowly and purred. I took that as a yes. What I didn't know then was that this was just the beginning of what would become the biggest HOA showdown Oakwood Heights had ever seen. I walked into the next HOA meeting with a folder of documents, prepared to calmly discuss the ridiculous fine. Karen was already there, perched at the head of the table like a queen on her throne, tapping her hot pink acrylic nails on the wood surface. The sight of her smug smile made my stomach turn. "Good evening, everyone," I said politely, taking my seat. That's when I noticed something strange. Half the usual board members were missing. In their place sat Karen's weekly tennis partners, Emily and another woman, Linda, who had never shown the slightest interest in HOA matters. Karen cleared her throat dramatically. "Let's address the violation regarding your unauthorized exotic animal," she said, drawing out every word like she was speaking to a child. "As documented, your pet clearly violates Section 8 of our bylaws." I had to bite back a laugh. "My cat, William, is a regular domestic shorthair," I said. "I've lived here for 15 years. He's been with me for 7 of them. I pulled out veterinary records. All his documentation is right here." But Karen wasn't even looking. She was too busy admiring her own manicure. "Rules are rules," she said flatly. Emily and Linda nodded in perfect unison. "The fine stands, and if the animal isn't removed within 30 days, additional penalties will apply." That's when something caught my eye outside the window. A cluster of bright pink flamingos on Karen's front lawn. Identical ones dotted the lawns of Emily and Linda as well. I remembered writing Section 7.3 about lawn ornaments. Flexible enough for reasonable decorations, but strict enough to prevent excessive displays. "Speaking of rules," I said calmly, "I couldn't help but notice the matching lawn decorations on your properties. Perhaps we should revisit the ornament guidelines too?" Karen's face flushed red. "Those are limited edition collector's items," she snapped. "Not common decorations. They're completely different." She shuffled her papers nervously. "Besides, we're here about your pet violation, not my artistic choices." I glanced around the room and started noticing other things. The meeting minutes folder looked suspiciously thin. The financial reports, usually stacked in the corner, were missing. And wasn't there supposed to be a public notice period before changing board membership? "I'd like to request copies of the last 6 months of meeting minutes," I said, keeping my voice even. "And while we're at it, I'd love to see the official documentation of the board member changes, just to ensure we're following proper procedures." Karen's eye twitched. "Those are confidential," she said quickly. "That's strange," I replied, "because Section 4.1 of the bylaws, again the ones I wrote, states that all HOA documents must be available upon member request within 10 business days. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. I stood up. "Until I receive those records, I will consider any actions taken by this board, particularly ones involving fines and enforcement authority, as I tucked my folder under my arm. "And by the way," I added, pausing at the door, "you might want to take another look at Section 3.2.2, because as of this moment, I'm formally submitting a motion for a special board election. Let's see how the rest of the neighborhood feels about your little initiative." As I walked out, I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Relief. This wasn't over, but it had officially begun. And karma, she'd just sharpened her claws. "Being reorganized for efficiency purposes," Karen Emma said, clearly dodging my earlier question. Then she quickly changed the subject. "Now, about your cat situation. We've had complaints about it disturbing the peace." "Really?" I said, pulling out my phone. "Because I have here an email from our previous board president specifically approving William's residence. Would you like to see it?" The room fell completely silent. Even Emily and Linda stopped their synchronized nodding. "This meeting is adjourned," Karen snapped abruptly, gathering her papers. "You'll receive further notice about your violations in writing." She practically ran out of the room, her heels clicking rapidly against the tile floor. As I walked home, pieces started falling into place in my mind. Jessica's bench fine, the missing board members, the mysterious reorganization of documents. Karen wasn't just being difficult about my cat. There was something much bigger going on here. And as the person who wrote these bylaws, I was probably the only one who could figure out exactly what it was. I looked down at my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number for James, our quiet, dependable treasurer. Maybe it was time to have a friendly chat about those missing financial reports. If Karen wanted to play by the rules, then we should make sure we were looking at all of them. Little did she know, she had just picked a fight with the one person in this community who knew every single word of those bylaws by heart. and I had a gut feeling those pink flamingos were just the tip of the iceberg. My hands were trembling as I spread out all the HOA violation notices across my dining room table. Something wasn't adding up, and I knew it. That morning I'd run into Jessica crying on her front porch, clutching a similar notice to mine. Her crime? The beautiful hand-carved memorial bench her grandchildren had gifted her in honor of their grandfather. Karen had called it an unauthorized structure. I started calling other neighbors. The pattern was undeniable. Every single homeowner who'd received a violation notice in the last 3 months either lived alone or was elderly. Not one of Karen's friends or their families had received any fines despite their very obvious violations. The Andersons had a bright purple front door, which Emily had called charming during the last meeting, even though our bylaws clearly required approval for external paint colors. My legal instincts kicked in. I pulled out my laptop and started documenting everything. Photos of Karen's friends' violations, the Williams' unauthorized above-ground pool, the Petersons' commercial vehicles parked in plain view, and of course, those ridiculous flamingos that seemed to multiply every week. Then I mapped out all the fines issued since Karen took over. The pattern was so blatant it made my stomach turn. Walking through the neighborhood with my camera, I noticed something even stranger. Karen's recent landscaping improvement had quietly extended her backyard about 3 feet into the community green space. I remembered handling the property surveys when I first drafted the bylaws. Every inch of land was accounted for. That night, I dug through old boxes in my basement until I found what I needed, the original property maps. But what really hit me was finding little Tommy from next door hiding behind my garage. He was scared to play basketball in his own driveway because Karen had threatened his parents with fines, calling the hoop an eyesore. Meanwhile, her own grandkids had an entire playground set up in their backyard that clearly exceeded our height restrictions. I made a trip to City Hall to check the public records. Turns out, Karen had never submitted the required paperwork for her recent home additions. That's when I discovered something that made my jaw drop. Her position as HOA president might not even be legitimate according to state laws regarding board elections. The next day, my doorbell rang. It was Daniel, our retired former maintenance supervisor. "I've been waiting for someone to start asking questions," he said, pulling a thick folder from his bag. "I kept copies of everything." Inside were maintenance requests Karen had denied without board approval, emails showing her directing contracts to her brother's company, and even photos of property damage she had blamed on innocent homeowners. Just as I was organizing all this evidence, my security camera caught Emily sneaking up to my porch. She didn't leave a notice this time. She was taking pictures of my front door, the same door that had been approved by the previous board 5 years ago. I smiled, knowing I had just caught her in the act of harassment. That evening, watching William curl up in his favorite window spot, I realized something important. This wasn't just about my cat anymore. Karen hadn't just picked a fight with me. She'd picked a fight with every decent homeowner in our neighborhood, and she had no idea that she was about to learn a very expensive lesson about the true purpose of the bylaws I had written. But first I needed to make one more call. To an old friend at the local newspaper. After all, nothing scares an HOA bully more than public exposure. I had a feeling tomorrow's board meeting was going to be very interesting indeed. At first I thought I was alone in this fight, but then, at 7 a.m. sharp, Jessica knocked on my door with a box full of old HOA letters. Her hands were shaking as she showed me 5 years' worth of unfair fines, all signed by Karen Emma with that same smug signature. While we sifted through the papers, 3 more neighbors stopped by, each carrying their own stack of documents and stories. That's when I knew for sure. This was bigger than just my cat. I started hosting quiet meetings in my garage every Tuesday night. At first it was just 5 of us, sharing stories over coffee and cookies. By the 3rd week, 15 residents packed into the space between my parked car and the storage shelves. Each person brought another piece to the puzzle. Photos of Karen's friends ignoring rules, copies of fee increases that had never gone through the proper process, even videos of her yelling at children for playing hopscotch in their own driveways. James, our quiet treasurer, surprised everyone one Sunday after church. He slipped me a USB drive and leaned in close. "I've been keeping track," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "The numbers don't add up." He was right. The spreadsheets showed thousands in miscellaneous maintenance fees that never resulted in any actual maintenance. Meanwhile, the community pool had been closed for 3 months because apparently we couldn't afford a new filter. That same week I reached out to Jim, the former board president now living in Florida. I explained everything in a detailed email. By the weekend, Jim had gone digging through his garage and found exactly what I needed: original meeting minutes from the year I wrote the bylaws, documents proving that Karen had been making up rules that didn't exist. Even better, he had audio recordings of meetings where Karen herself had voted in favor of the very policies she was now fining people for violating. My dining room turned into a full-blown detective's office. I had maps of the neighborhood pinned with colored markers. Red pins for every rule Karen ignored for her friends, green pins for every unfair fine she issued to everyone else. The pattern was so blatant it looked like a Christmas disaster. Maria from 2 streets over brought a timeline of suspicious landscaping awards Karen had handed out, coincidentally only to her tennis buddies. Daniel came back with proof that Karen had approved an unlicensed contractor to work on HOA property. And Jessica? She brought cookies and a stack of letters showing that Karen had denied every single community event proposal for the past year unless it came from her own circle. We weren't just neighbors anymore, we were investigators, strategists, and soon reformers. And tomorrow at the board meeting, we were going to make sure our voices were finally heard. The local newspaper, whose editor's daughter had been fined for having the wrong color basketball hoop, started asking questions about our HOA's financial records. Funny how Karen Emma suddenly had a scheduling conflict when asked for an interview. Even funnier was watching her speed walk away from the mailbox when she saw me coming with my camera, documenting how her own yard didn't meet the standards she was enforcing on everyone else. The real breakthrough came when Lisa, who works at the county clerk's office, discovered that Karen had never properly filed several required HOA documents. She'd been so busy writing up fines she'd forgotten to maintain the HOA's legal standing. I couldn't help but smile. All those years I spent making sure every I was dotted and every T was crossed while writing these bylaws were about to pay off. As our evidence pile grew, so did our confidence. People stopped paying Karen's ridiculous fines. Kids started playing outside again. Jessica put up wind chimes. And for the first time in months, their gentle tinkling wasn't met with an immediate violation notice. We were ready for the next board meeting, where Karen would learn that karma doesn't just knock. Sometimes it brings the whole neighborhood with it. The community center buzzed with tension as I walked in, binder of evidence in hand. Karen sat at the head table, wearing her usual smug smile and designer blazer, completely unaware of what was coming. The room was packed. I'd never seen so many neighbors attend a board meeting before. Even Mr. Jenkins, who hadn't left his house since his hip surgery, had somehow made it. I noticed Karen's smile falter slightly as she saw me confidently walk to the podium. Her friend Emily leaned over and whispered something in her ear, but Karen waved her off. Big mistake. "Before we discuss the ridiculous fine about my cat," I began, my voice calm and steady, "I'd like to address some concerning patterns I've discovered." I pulled out the first document from my binder, a property map of our neighborhood. Funny how every single fine issued in the past 6 months has been given to homes marked in red on this map. Karen's face twitched. "Those are simply the violations we found." "Interesting," I cut in, "because these red marks perfectly match the homes of people who voted against your election last year." The room erupted in whispers. "And speaking of violations," I continued, "let's talk about Article 2, Section 14 of our bylaws." Karen's face went pale. She knew exactly what section that was. I had written it specifically to prevent abuse of power. The projection screen behind me lit up with archived photos of her house, your unapproved pool installation last summer, the commercial vehicle parking violations, and oh yes, those lovely pink flamingos that somehow received a special exemption. Emily jumped up, her voice shrill. "This is harassment!" I calmly pulled out another document. "Actually, Emily, according to the legal definition of harassment, which I've highlighted here from Section 8.2, a clause I also wrote, this is called documented evidence of bylaw violations." I raised my brow. "Would you like me to continue?" "I also have photos of your unauthorized fence extension." The room went dead silent. I could see James, our treasurer, trying to hide a smile. Karen's hands shook as she shuffled through her papers, desperately trying to find something to counter with. But the real issue, I continued, pulling out Jessica's fine notice, isn't just selective enforcement. It's the blatant disregard for our community's values. This fine, I held it up, was issued to Jessica for a memorial bench. A bench that falls well within the acceptable guidelines I specifically included in Section 57 about memorial structures. Jessica, sitting in the front row, wiped away a tear as several neighbors patted her shoulder. Karen's face had gone from pale to bright red. I saved the best for last, I said, turning the page. And now about my cat. William, the so-called exotic pet that triggered this entire investigation. I clicked the projector. This is the original HOA pet clause. I wrote it 10 years ago, specifically including language to protect reasonable pet ownership. I turned to the crowd. Would anyone like to guess who approved it? A pause. That's right, our former board president who sent me this notarized statement confirming it. The room erupted. Half laughter, half angry muttering. Karen finally stood, her voice trembling with rage. This is all circumstantial. You can't actually... James stood, holding up a folder. I have the financial records, he said, showing unauthorized administration of fees that weren't approved by the board. Should we discuss those too? Karen looked around the room, realizing she was cornered. Her face twisted into an ugly scowl as she grabbed her things. This isn't over, she growled. I'll sue every single one of you. I smiled. Section 128, Karen. Frivolous legal threats against board members carry a $1,000 fine. Would you like me to add that to your tab? The room went quiet again as I opened my laptop and connected it to the projector. Karen's smirk faded instantly when the first slide appeared. A side-by-side comparison of her home's unapproved bright purple trim with the exact bylaw she'd used to fine 3 other homeowners for their non-standard paint colors. Let's start with something simple, I said, keeping my tone even, which I wrote during the great paint color debate of 2010. I clicked through photos showing each of Karen's friends' violations matched with the fines given to others for the same infractions. Emily shifted uncomfortably when her 3-foot garden gnome collection appeared on screen. James stood again. I've got something to add, he said, pulling out another stack of papers. These are bank statements showing unusual administrative charges made only to homeowners who filed complaints against board members in the past year. The room buzzed with whispers. Karen jumped to her feet, her face now as purple as her house trim. This is a witch hunt. You can't prove anything. She grabbed her designer purse, nearly knocking over her water bottle. I'll sue every single one of you. I raised a hand. Before you make threats, Karen, you might want to review this clause. I pulled it up on the projector. I added this specifically to protect homeowners from retaliatory legal action. Any board member making unfounded legal threats faces immediate removal and a fine equal to the legal fees they're threatening to cause. Jessica, who had been quietly watching from the front row, slowly stood up. Her voice was soft but steady. When my Henry died, she began, I just wanted a small bench to remember him by. She held up a wrinkled violation notice. You told me it was against the rules and fined me $1,000. She pulled another paper from her bag. But I found this old newsletter where you approved your friend's entire backyard memorial fountain. More neighbors began speaking up. The family fined for an unauthorized basketball hoop showed photos of Karen's backyard filled with unpermitted playground equipment. A college student who'd been fined for parking his unsightly work truck produced documentation showing Karen's own son regularly parked a broken-down RV on the street. The hypocrisy was laid bare. Karen stood frozen, eyes wide, hands trembling, and in that moment she realized what we had all known for weeks. Her reign was over. Karen Emma's face went from purple to white as the evidence mounted. She tried to interrupt, but each time she opened her mouth, I calmly pulled up another bylaw, each one I had personally written, clearly showing how she had violated it. When she realized half the room was recording everything on their phones, she made one last desperate attempt. This is all hearsay. I demand to see the original bylaws. She thought she had me there. Most HOAs lose track of their original documents over time. Lucky for us, I'd kept every single version, complete with detailed notes, signatures, and time-stamped revisions. I projected my final slide, a scanned copy of the original bylaws complete with my signature and notary stamp. Then I zoomed in on the most fitting part. Article 7, Section 3. No board member shall selectively enforce these bylaws for personal gain or vendetta. I smiled. I added that after our last power-hungry president tried something similar. The vote was unanimous. Karen was officially removed from the board, along with Emily and 2 other members who had supported her scheme. The new board's first act? Approving Jessica's memorial bench, complete with a small flower garden that the neighbors helped plant the following weekend. As for my cat, William, he got his own special amendment added to the bylaws. All felines shall be considered pre-approved residents, as they ultimately do whatever they want anyway. I even framed his honorary HOA inspector certificate and hung it right next to my law degree. But the best part came 3 weeks later, when Karen tried to sell her house to escape the embarrassment. Turns out, the unapproved purple trim she'd painted violated the very bylaws she'd once enforced so gleefully. Before the sale could go through, she was required to repaint it. The new color? A lovely shade called Karma Gray.